Hello, my name is Jessie, and I just wanted to speak a bit about a film I watched recently, which has pretty quickly become a favourite. Lurker came out in 2024, even though I only just watched it. I think also the way that I was introduced to this movie was definitely like a big part of like how I enjoyed it. I sort of just watched it on a whim. I think I heard about it like very fleetingly last year, but I wasn't really aware of any like discussion or whatever. And these days I do like to watch movies sort of just quite bare, like without intaking any sort of discourse about it. It's really tempting to watch, to hear from like cast and crew and directors and online discourse as well. But I think that I sort of stumbled across this movie in a way that kind of felt like it was a discovery. So that kind of added to, I think, the effect that the movie had for me. But anyway, I could talk about it at length. I've watched it for the first time about 2 days ago, and I've watched it like 4 times since. So I'm sort of like haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I even did this drawing to kind of accompany it. Yeah, well, I don't know if that looks a bit weird, but anyway, okay. So every time I watch this movie, a dimension of it pops out to me even more. I think that if you're just watching it on the pure narrative, on like a purely narrative sort of initial reading where you're kind of just watching the sequence of events, it's a really compelling story in which we see Matthew Morning, who's our main character, who's sort of parasocially attached to our other main character, Oliver, who is a pop star in this universe, film set in LA. We see Matthew go to increasing lengths to kind of increase his proximity to Oliver, and we sort of see the depth of his parasociality play out in the course of the film as he does increasingly more disturbing, stalker, lurker behaviour. So on the face of it, it's sort of quite thrilling, I'd say, probably it's very psychologically thrilling, but there's something quite restrained, and there's something quite purposeful about the dialogue and about sort of the sparse nature of, like, we've got a pretty tight cast of characters, and it really is focusing on that, like what's playing out between kind of like object of desire and then subject, but I think it's because the narrative is so simple in terms of what's actually happening on screen. This movie blew me away from, I think, how elegantly and how pointed the dialogue and the script really is in serving in kind of like reinforcing the themes and unspoken themes in this film, as well as the performances are like incredible, especially Matthew, Morning. He's a character who is like quite restrained, like immediately, and quite like quiet. He's very watchful, very he's like a camera himself. He's like surveilling his environment constantly, but his face has to convey the complexity of the inner landscape that motivates his actions. And that's what I wanted to talk about, is that this movie is, if you are fascinated as I am in psychology and social dynamics and the sort of, what motivates people at their core and intrinsically, and what drives people to make the decisions that they do and behave the way they do externally, and like how is that reconciled with what's happening internally, this movie is fantastic for that. It's essentially like an exploration of Matthew Morning sort of inner landscape, because as you watch the film, you know, what's going on is so much more layered than I think an initial reading of the text of watching of the film. It's like we're essentially exploring this character's interior landscape, because he's not operating in the same plane of reality as the characters around him. And it kind of shows you how, not only how does he negotiate the sort of inner absence with the external presentation, but then also the movie asks the question of, you know, what social dynamics and what kind of unspoken silent social dynamics among the external group that surrounds Oliver, how does that play into the positioning of our main character? Like, you know, what does that sort of permit, or what does it invite and encourage in character like Matthew's behavior? So firstly, Oliver is the object of Matthew's sort of obsessive parasocial fixation, but ultimately his fixation is sort of a force in and of itself that isn't really about Oliver fundamentally. And I think like this is quite this is an interesting point to start from, because it is both singular to this character, but it's also quite universal. I think especially in the age we are now of like parasociality and the proximity we seemingly have to people that are like public figures, it's very easy for someone with Matthew's personality orientation and the set of structures that kind of that inform his logic, his social logic. It's very easy for someone with that particular set of traits to sort of feed those impulses, given that socially there is kind of a big appetite and a big sort of there's a lot of resource for sort of our attachment to celebrity and our sense that we know them, or that our enjoyment of them, or our consumption of them then informs our own sense of identity for ourselves. In this movie kind of explores what happens when those paradigms are executed to their very extreme, and there's not an internal scaffolding or external scaffolding to kind of keep it within the confines of like social and moral acceptable behavior. So his fixation isn't really about Oliver. I think Matthew is a character that has a sort of vacantness, not in that he's very intelligent and very sort of cunning and calculating, but at the same time, you get the impression from him that he's both extremely calculated in one regard, but also extremely impulsive in the other, in that you get the sense he's living in an internal environment that is driven by a singular focus, and that is getting close to Oliver. And he sees people and interactions and relationships and life itself as kind of something that is either an obstacle or a tool to help him achieve that very singular goal. But when you peel back the layers, that goal is supplementing a kind of, I got cut off, sorry. So, let me continue. Actually, let me scale it back. So, I think that this movie is, on the surface, a super kind of apt, unsettling look into what, I suppose, what parasociality can look like at an extreme level. But as I pointed out, I don't think it's even really about him being a fan of Oliver, and more about the attachment, what the need for the attachment to Oliver is perhaps supplementing in his psyche. And I guess how unnerving it can be when we organize ourselves around or curate an identity that is exclusively externally based. And watching it play out in a very extreme presentation, like he's on this side of the spectrum, is very confronting and very unnerving. But there are layers to it, and I think the more you watch and the more that we discuss, there's something chillingly universal, or so there's something under there that I think is quite like human, and actually quite indicative of like something that rings unsettlingly true. So I think that we've got the need to be seen, which I suppose can be firstly exemplified in Matthew, but also exemplified in Oliver. If we look if we look a little bit closer, Matthew is the extreme of any given, inner internal drive, front-facing social navigation. But I think that what he's motivated by is present in other characters and other systems. It's just presented in a different way because it exists still within the confines, or it's kind of contained by a kind of social compliance. And so because Matthew violates the social compliance, and he's odd, and he is actually not actually inherently in touch with social or moral boundaries of any kind, he is able to embody his impulse and his fixation in a way that is more disturbing than the other characters. But the other characters have an uncomfortable recognition of Matthew, and yet a social drive, a socially reinforced drive, not to overtly challenge him. We'll talk more about that. So there's what it means to be seen. So Oliver as the object. What it means to need to be seen, and what happens when that need or those needs become the primary organizing force of your life and your identity. Both on the Matthew perspective, who's kind of an encroaching outsider, creepy figure on the margins, but also Oliver, who could represent some similar kind of existential drives, but from the position of being the center of attention, the object of fame, and the object of people's sort of social compliance. But yet that position in its own way renders you disconnected from the world in the same way that Matthew is. It's just Oliver sort of represents that at sort of an opposite social positioning. So I think that Matthew's a fascinating character, and huge props to the actor, because he went crazy, because like he is not just playing Matthew, but he's playing Matthew who Matthew was playing Matthew. Matthew is constructing. Okay. Matthew is chilling, not just because he can be extremely calculating and like socially manipulative, not just because his eyes scan every interaction like a living camera, which I think speaks to the themes of this movie, but also like what's going on in our generation. But he's not just unsettling because of that. It's that he, while going in one moment from being extremely calculating and manipulative, he also has this like air of complete impulsivity, meaning that in any given moment, any decision he needs to make in order to sustain the reality that he's creating around himself via his proximity to Oliver, he will do anything it takes in order to regain control of that reality and to keep it intact. So any threats to it, we don't know what he's capable of, which I think makes for a very compelling sort of psychologically complex character when we we are figuring out, or we are kind of watching their internal logic unfold in real time. Matthew only has a singular goal, and he has a limited grasp on social compliance and social demands. And sometimes, in some moments, he sort of assimilates himself with them, and he sort of utilizes them in order to get where he's going. But in times where they don't serve him, he is able to chillingly drop them. He can drop the niceties, and his face can actually reveal this inner state that he has of complete single-minded focus and moral vacancy. Absolutely incredible for Theodore, I think, is the main actor. So I did not do much research about the movie. All I have is the movie, which I think is a great way to watch it. But sorry to like the main actor, but he did such an incredible job, because it's like, to not only play a character, but to play a character who is creating themselves in real life in response to constantly shifting social paradigms and dynamics is insane. Because one could sort of expand that out to kind of a caricature of a character to make it bigger, because like we say, the cast and the setting is actually quite sparse. So in order to sort of like embed that, to convey that complexity, the psychological complexity to the audience, he could have leaned into like a lot more exaggeration. But the thing about that is that it sort of flattens that kind of complexity into like a good or bad supervillain archetype. And this movie is contending with layers that are much more complex than assigning Matthew a good, bad, Oliver good, bad thing. It's he does things that are indefensible, like, don't get it twisted. But when we are brought into his internal logic, everything he does is not necessarily done for the sake of harm. It's not really about anybody else. It's a completely unmoored, ruthless pursuit of survival. Because if he is not this attachment, if he is not embodying this attachment to Oliver, there is nothing in that attachment's place. He is outsourcing identity from this. So he cannot afford, at least I'm speaking from the condition that his psyche is in, he cannot afford to have that connection threatened. So yeah, whatever it takes. And it makes for a super ruthless but also extremely compelling character to follow. But let's talk about Oliver, because I think first reading you're sort of focused on Matthew, and you're kind of like, disoriented by Matthew's at sometimes he is watching him navigate social dynamics is endless food for thought. But let's talk about Oliver for a second, because I think Oliver reflects a kind of similar isolation as Matthew, a similar loneliness, a similar outsourcing of identity, but his is from the center. He is affirmed, but also kind of created and reinforced by the attention given to him. And although he's not authoritative, ruthless, cold, or he's not socially disattuned, I don't know if that's a word, but he is very socially fluent and warm and charismatic, and he's an artist and a creative. He's very magnetic, and but there is a suggestion of hierarchy and control in the ecosystem that is created from his fame and from his main characterness, him being the star. And he seems, and his group seems to, on the surface, on a superficial level, they all seem to not acknowledge that hierarchy exists. They relate like peers and friends, and the movie implies that they're old friends and they're now creative collaborators. But when your livelihood or your sort of creative or professional, but also personal identity is connected to the success of your friend who is this complete star and this complete this source for so much attention, whether you acknowledge it or not, you're all participating in a certain kind of hierarchy that ultimately feeds Oliver's fixed position within that group. So, in other words, he is this kind of planet that I can't think of words, but he is the planet that his friends orbit around and thus organize themselves around. That's the system they organize themselves around. And so probably implicitly, there's more layers to their relationship with Oliver than anyone would comfortably admit. What we see is admiration, affirmation, and they kind of collaborate with him and bounce off him. But there are moments that Oliver allows us to see, and I don't think he knows, or I don't think he's actually contended with this, but he does embody it. But we do see that ultimately he is the group leader and he does exert control, but he doesn't do it the way Matthew does it. He does it in a socially connected kind of way. He masks commands inside jokes, and he often, the group's stability or people's position within that group is reinforced by their ability to sort of respond to Oliver's whims, his creative whims, his whatever. And so that actually does create like a high pressure and kind of unreciprocal kind of environment, but it's uncomfortable to acknowledge, so they don't say it. And I think what unnerves them about Matthew is they all clock that Matthew's a bit weird of a weirdo, but they can't actually overtly act on their obvious discomfort or suspicion because they silently are upholding a sort of group, an ecosystem of their own. And so to sort of reveal Oliver would be sort of to reveal and expose themselves. And that is a bit of a part of why, sorry, did I say Oliver? To reveal Matthew would be to reveal themselves. And so they unintentionally play a role in this kind of social safeguard that Matthew is able to kind of keep on ascending within the group structure, because to outright call him out would be to contradict the wishes of Oliver, which they all are sort of beholden to, and they're very conscious of challenging. So what does that say about Oliver? I think the clues that, because another thing I love about this movie is that we don't get explicit, like highly detailed backstories, but if you pay enough attention and you read between the lines, we actually get a lot of information about what could be informing these characters kind of motivations and like where they're coming from. So with Oliver, when he's talking to Matthew about his family, we learn two things. His dad is a sort of absent and unsupportive sort of character. He references sending him money every month, despite them not really being close or his dad not being supportive. So we've got sort of a lecherous, at least from Oliver's characterization, we've got sort of a lecherous relationship there, a one-sided thing where he is supplementing he's supplying his dad with something, but he's not really getting anything back. And then, when Matthew follows up with a question about his mum, he just says, next question. He doesn't give us any detail, but the avoidance of the question is telling in itself, and it gives us enough we need to know, which is that it's strained. Shortly after, he references moving to LA at 18 by himself was was the best memory of his life. So that tells you that him essentially entering his music career, but from a kind of isolated place, was the best event in his life, which obviously led to him where he is now, which is like famous and all this kind of stuff. But what does it say about his relationship to family? Well, since we can infer that he hasn't had a very strong or supportive or unconditional relationship to love and support, we can infer a few things. Because in this same conversation with Matthew, he also says that he loves the life he has now, being that he has a new family now, his words, he has a new family now, and he gets to choose who's in it. Beautiful example of what this movie does so well with its writing. It doesn't give you too much, but if you're listening and you're paying attention, one sentence has several layers underneath. Because on one hand, he's saying a very very familiar story that we've heard of, like chosen family. He's essentially referencing that he's gotten to curate his family despite not having a necessarily supportive birth family. So it sounds warm. Again, it sounds like the Oliver that we are consuming. It sounds like Oliver the product. It sounds like an underdog story. And it's relatable. And I don't think he's lying. But there is another kind of reading of that just underneath the surface where he says, I have a new family now and I get to choose who's in it. I get to choose who's in it. I get to choose who's in it. I control this family. I curate this family. I control this ecosystem. And I do so in a friendly way. And I do so with a kind of creative, free-spirited temperament. But I created my family. Why that's interesting is because I think it's our first insight into what Oliver may be deriving from his group dynamic, but also his relationship with fame. And this idea that his identity could be something a bit incomplete or fractured as well. But he is getting validation, but more richly, he's getting identity from having himself mirrored back to himself via fans and sycophantic behavior. But it's people's awareness of social cues that allows them to play into this role that kind of aims itself at Oliver, but they're able to sort of enact this role without breaching the social, without popping the social bubble that surrounds it and making everyone feel uncomfortable. It is present, but it is unstated. But Matthew kind of serves as a disruption to this. Not only a literal disruption in that he uncomfortably wedges his way into that group, but he kind of does so with this ever-evolving combination of complete disregard for the rules and also an ability to perform the rules when necessary. And it's that constant negotiation of internal motivation and internal like psychological makeup juxtaposed against external performance and social performance and expectations that makes this movie so fucking good, bro. And I love shit like this, as you can tell, but I think this was done so elegantly. I think it's so every line of dialogue and every scene is super powerful and effective and multi-layered. So Oliver, Matthew, the group that surrounds them, the group of friends, let's talk about those friends. Let's talk a bit about the friend group. Okay, the friend group. It's uncomfortable, but I think it's real. I think it's because, okay, this could be a bit reductive, but I think that there is a lopsided understanding of friendship, connection, identity in this film. I think it's one-sided when we see Matthew expressing it toward Oliver, where he is extracting from Oliver his own sense of supply and his own sense of identity. And it's extractive when we see Oliver sort of, you know, he is feeding, like his friends are extracting kind of social positioning, access, you know, creative opportunities. They're sort of extracting that from existing around in Oliver's orbit. But then you could argue that Oliver is also sort of extracting that sense of identity from his fans, and this kind of the fact he's able to project a version of himself that is admired, loved, mirrored, echoed, in lieu of, I guess, in lieu of truly existing in the true isolation of fame. Matthew says something really, really apt to him when they have that kind of confrontation in the recording studio toward the end, where he says, you know, you're alone. It's in one of Matthew's chilling moments of lucidity, because he goes from being sort of like, you kind of go from questioning if he's like just kind of an automated machine, or if he is aware of what he's doing, or if there is any kind of ability to look inward. And he oscillates between the two, and we have these flashes into lucidity, which are some of my favorite moments in the film. And in one of them, he actually says to Oliver, you know, I am exactly the same as all your friends. I'm just better at it, and I want it more. In one hand, a very, very cold, cutting, potentially manipulation in order to sort of affirm Oliver's very worst fears about him, his fame and his friends, and like maybe not knowing what's real. But on the other hand, I don't think he's trying necessarily to hurt Oliver, but I think that through the self-serving, sort of brutally honest, not socially attuned lens that he experiences the world, he is telling Oliver his version of the truth. He says, these people are here in relation to you. Even if you want to feel like they're equal to you, you're on the other side. You're alone. He says that to Oliver, and Oliver looks visibly sort of he looks kind of visibly saddened, and but it doesn't look like it's the first time he's kind of thought that. But his whole setup is he creates a reality that allows him to deny that. But I think Matthew pierces right to the core of it, and he says, yeah, essentially we're the same. I'm just, you know, and I'm paraphrasing, but he's essentially saying, you know, I'm just at this extreme end of a spectrum that everybody you know is on. And you're alone. And yeah. And the thing is that Oliver's response to this is actually quite telling, because he says, please don't take this away from me. And what he's asking is for Matthew to not use the blackmail that he's gathered to, you know, destroy or end Oliver's career. But it's so much deeper than that. He's saying, don't take this away from me. This is me. This is my identity. It actually echoes in the script. It echoes the phrasing of earlier in that conversation, where, you know, Oliver's trying to convince him to delete the video, and then Matthew responds with, yeah, but I can't do that because you took this away from me. Meaning that when Oliver denied Matthew access to the group after Matthew kind of snapped and pushed his friend, and it did disturb the whole group dynamic, and they got rid of him briefly, and he was able to worm his way back in through blackmail. He essentially says to Oliver in the scene, you know, when you cast me out, you took this away from me. That moment, he is the most introspective we've ever seen him in this movie. And it's not introspection done to do better. It's introspection to honestly convey to Oliver, the reality of Matthew's situation, which is that I need this. I need this identity. This is me. And you took that away from me. So I have to make sure that that never happens again. Is it twisted? Is it controlling? Is it a little crazy? Hell yeah. But there's a core to it that is actually like, he's telling the truth. He is in that moment acknowledging that there is an absence where a person should be within him. And that is existentially soothed by him being a fan of Oliver. And not just a fan, whatever to Oliver. You know, I don't think he starts this movie explicitly wanting a career, or it's funny, it's not the typical clout chaser kind of story, because I feel like Oliver's friend group would probably fit a little bit more into the definitions of like the typical clout chasers, where it's maybe a little bit more socially motivated or a bit more career motivated. Matthew, it is not motivated by any of those. He doesn't care about people. He doesn't care about his career. He is just sort of existing in this kind of existential purgatory until he has a reason to be. And that reason, for whatever reason, is Oliver. That's the thing he's decided is going to be his being. So when Oliver denies him that, he goes into a sort of psychological non-existence. To him, it is akin to like death or non-being. So it's not that he's trying to be this antagonist. He is someone who, it's like a survival drive. He must keep his thing in, he must keep his identity intact, and therefore he must reinforce and control the reality that houses the identity that he is depending on, and he is outsourcing from Oliver. But then Oliver, more than he'd like to admit, is semi-reliant himself upon this feedback loop and this mirror that other people provide to him in the form of their reactions to him. His friend group is, dependent on him ultimately. And his friend group are in a kind of unspoken competition with each other. We see a scene earlier where a member of his team gets like fired, it looks like. And we don't hear the dialogue, but we see it happen. But, we kind of see that, this ecosystem around Oliver is very contingent upon Oliver's whims, his moods, his creative instincts. And they all seem superficially supportive of him, but there is a layer to it that seems a little performative. And, it comes out in jokes, like when Matthew refers to Oliver as Ollie, which they all find a little bit weird, and they sort of make fun of him a little bit and say, like, you sound like one of his bitches, which is kind of funny. That was like a Zach Fox bit, so it was funny. But then Zach Fox kind of says after that, he's like, well, I call that man sir. And they're kidding, but they're not. They're referencing the fact that, like, he's the boss at the end of the day, So they're all kind of bullshitting a little bit, which is what Matthew very chillingly tells Oliver. And so in that moment, Oliver's kind of confronted with a choice. And on the first layer of it, it's like it's kind of a blackmail kind of choice. It's a coercive choice. Maybe that's a contradiction of a phrase, but it's a coercion in which he's sort of like he's made victim to Matthew's control. But he's also sort of being forced to confront the truth about what he values. And so we fast forward and, they're showing this documentary to a crowd, and it's kind of implying that, Matthew at this point has embedded himself fully into Oliver's creative team, at least to the public. He's a part of his sort of entourage. But he is notably unclear about what his role actually is. And I think that's the public's only slight insight, is like, he occasionally gets asked, like, what do you do? And like, he's not ever able to answer the question. But when they're screening this thing and it's implied that he's kind of like integrated into Oliver's like creative whatever, you know, a fan asks Oliver a question that I think is super interesting. And then also Matthews had asked a question. So we'll start with Oliver's question. The question posed to Oliver from this member in the crowd is, you know, what motivates you? Like what keeps you going creatively? And Oliver answers with a super well written answer where he says, when people tell me that there's something I can't do. Another beautiful double line, another beautifully layered line, because on the surface and to the audience, it sounds like an underdog story. It sounds consistent with at least the image of Oliver that we are privy to, you know, or the narrative around like him as a star, him as a creative, like, which is that, you know, if you tell him he can't do something, if you limit him, then that's going to motivate him to make his best work. And it's almost like we applaud that sentiment when we hear artists say it. But because we understand the twisted and uncomfortable reality of his relationship with Matthew, we understand that statement is literal. When he says, when someone tells me there's something I can't do, I think it shows that the exchange, the control has fully sort of embedded itself into their dynamic. You know, Matthew is now a presence that ostensibly can tell Matthew is a presence that ostensibly can tell Oliver what he can and can't do. So that's literal. That's not just poetic. He is saying, when someone tells me what I can't do, that's what inspires me. But interestingly, that's what is twisted, is that Matthew is able to kind of embed himself and sort of manipulate, but also manipulate and kind of capitalize on Oliver's repressed seeking of identity from the fact that he's famous and he's constantly being consumed. Like, he resists control superficially, like he seems free-spirited and whatnot, and so he seems like he's sort of resistant to control, but it seems like the kind of role that perception plays in his life is a controlling force that isn't necessarily healthy, but it does push him to creative expression, which is like a long kind of long discussed, like super interesting like paradigm of like creativity and fame and all this kind of stuff, and the kind of thing of, I'm not saying it's a good thing or a healthy dynamic, but I think it is oddly, in a very kind of like subversive, twisted way, I think Matthew's assertion of control over Oliver ends up informing Oliver's creativity, or like, you know, it kind of ends up, I think, supplying or feeding Oliver's sense of identity, which then informs his sense of informs his creativity, and how, you know, he seems to derive a lot from being witnessed. He arguably is constructing himself a little bit in conjunction to being perceived. So this hyper extreme of a person who over perceives him is uncomfortable and ugly and confronting, but within within his like internal paradigm, and then also the social and parasocial sort of infrastructure of fame. It's like okay, it's an oppositional presence. He resents it, he resists it, he denies it, he fights it. But it's also a force that is so pervasive, and it's so much like the water that he swims in, that it is indistinguishable from himself. And so even in overtly resisting it, he participates in it and he reacts against it. And so some would view Matthew as like an antagonistic force in his life, and he certainly is. He's harmful, he's got no boundaries, he's completely self-motivated and extractive. But he is such a unwavering sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? He's like a concentrate of all of these dynamics that Oliver is actually become codependent with. And so he is so forceful that he's a force that Oliver actually reacts against. How does he react against it? In the way that creative people often do, which is artistically. So this movie could be like an exploration of so many things. Parasociality, maybe. Although, to be honest, I don't think this is what's going on with exclusively, mega fans. I think this is a level beyond. But I think it's also exploring social dynamics, what they protect, and also what they reinforce, and what they allow, what they permit, and who do they serve, and who participates in them, and to what extent does everybody participate in them. And then it's also like, what is the object of so many people's sort of lopsided admiration and fixation? How does the object of that attention metabolize it and sort of understand it and disperse it for themselves? How do they actually operate within it? And what does it constitute in their own psychological landscape and their own identity, personhood? Brilliant. I could talk about every single character because there's not that many characters. I'm also very interested in Matthew's friend, not at all a friend. But yeah, I think that his role in the story is to kind of exemplify how much, how callous Matthew kind of is at core. And his friend is someone who he's sort of fundamentally indifferent to. I think he's almost just like, he's like existential, like background, like landscaping. He's like functionally the same as a tree, except when he becomes noticed or seen by Oliver, he becomes a threat to Matthew, at which point he becomes an object like that, like of hostility and control. Love that scene at the party, which is the still that I drew is from the scene at the party, where the friend they're gassing up his friend's sweater that he wore to the party, that actually on their way into the party Matthew kind of scoffed at and was like, why are you wearing that? And then they actually really respond well to it. And they're sort of asking him like, oh bro, can you make me one, blah blah blah, everyone, Oliver and his whole group. And Matthew freaking like, bro, his performances, Matthew has this like amazing, he cycles through this like extremely complex like facial expression, which all at once kind of inhabits rage because he doesn't like the attention being directed at his friend, that he sort of brought into this scenario to kind of assert that like he belongs there, his friend doesn't. But he kind of brought him into it because I think he did sort of briefly want a witness to like what he's been able to achieve by infiltrating the group, but not so much of a witness he didn't want an equal. He didn't want another participant. He wanted an accessory or a witness to what he was doing. So when their attention is briefly drawn to him, and interestingly, their attention is drawn to him because of something he's actually done, which is also a subtle question this movie kind of toys with, is like this recurring question of people asking Matthew, like, what do you actually bloody do? And this idea of like, there's always like in a famous person's entourage and in their sort of like surroundings, it seems to be constructed of a lot of people that we don't really know like what they do explicitly. It could speak to the kind of informal aspect of like creativity and how a lot of things aren't like formalized into roles, or a lot of things are like a friend of a friend or a homie that became your, photographer and stuff. But there's also a lot of room within that kind of like that sort of non-formal nature, that there's a lot of room within it that it could be kind of corrupted or infiltrated. That's an interesting conversation to have. Does it help to have some sort of streamline into kind of who is actually surrounding as a public figure or celebrity? Because it feels like there's so many entries that people with questionable intentions could kind of get close, as we see with Matthew. But when they respond to his friend positively, it's because they're reacting to like the sweater that his friend made, which I think is another sort of jab to Matthew, because it's not just that they're paying attention to him, but it's also like he scoffed at that sweater and kind of like sort of made it seem like it was lame, and the fact they like it is kind of like, annoying to him. But then it's also that like I think there's a slight connectedness that his friend has to the group that Matthew can't counterfeit it. He can't mimic it. He can't mimic the ease with which some people can integrate socially and naturally infer the unspoken languages and rhythms of social like exchanges. So his friend is kind of just being himself and wearing a sweater that is just him being himself, and they respond to that, as people often do, because like they're responding to something that he genuinely made, and he didn't really wear it with the explicit like purpose of them validating it. He wore it because he liked it. So like even their positive response to it, I think, kind of not explicitly, or not in a way that it's worded like this, but the subtext of the scene is almost like that could be a sort of existential, like that could be confronting to Matthew. The very idea that someone could just be themselves and be responded to, seen, validated, mirrored from but originating from just themselves as the source, as opposed to a performance. So I think there's kind of like a kind of acute jealousy there. But then he kind of cycles through all this facial expression. It's like a really sort of it's a really, really sort of like a smirk that's almost a grimace, that's almost like his eyes are wide and highly alert, but he's kind of attempting to look like intoxicated and like he's half paying attention, and he's like laughing, but he's like laughing kind of at the wrong moments. And then he's got the body language of someone that's like trying to just like, yeah, man, whatever. But like he's paying such close attention to every single word that his friend is saying and that they're saying to his friend. And then he kind of he lets it go back and forth for a while, and you see the rage on his face and all that. And then finally he says like, oh, I'll add him to the group chat. So he tries to like kind of take control, be like, I'll facilitate this guy's access to the group. Brilliant.